Hey folks, welcome back to Ken Michaels Radio. Thanks to all of you who have been watching my shows here, and I've had so much fun, as you know, talking about the Beatles with sometimes one guest, several guests. Sometimes it will be me completely on my own. That just might happen one of these days. Here on the show, we talk about anything that has to do with the Beatles, the group years, the solo years, and we're going to continue with another of my shows in which the concept, it's actually called Youngblood, in which I interview the younger generation of Beatle fans. They have to be 40 and under. In my case, anybody who's younger than me is a younger fan.
Life begins at 40, so.
This is very good, Dylan. He's just so good. Right off the cuff, just like that. Anyway, so we're going to welcome three of our guests who have been on my channel before. And let's start with Skylar Moody. Skylar has her own TikTok channel, which has a lot of Beatles content on it. And I just was made aware that you started your own George Harrison podcast.
Yes, ironically though, because he's not my favorite Beatle, he's my second favorite, but it is a George Harrison podcast. It's called Apple Scruffs. I host it with my friends Katie and Layla, and we have our third episode coming out this Friday, the 22nd, where we talk about some of our Beatles adventures that we went on last month, if you are so inclined to listen.
Okay. And you already have three other people here that would like to be guests on your show, so just want to put them in the same process.
It's how it
Got to get some guest stars. The more the merrier.
Okay, we also have Dylan Sevey with us. Dylan is a musician from Nashville. He actually comes from Rhode Island. And from what I understand, because I used to live on Long Island, when Dylan heard that I was moving to Connecticut, he just bolted out of Rhode Island and moved to Nashville because he wanted to get as far away from me as possible. So Dylan plays the drums, guitar. He's been a guest on my channel, Ken Michaels Radio. He's been a guest frequently on Two Legs. He puts together those intros and outros. What's that?
And Sam's channel.
I'm about to say that.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm not done. The instrumentals for the intro and the outro of Two Legs is also done by Dylan. And he's also been on Sam's show, which we're about to talk about in just a moment. Dylan, welcome aboard.
Thanks again for having me, Ken. And to pull back the curtain here, I was completely unaware who the other guests were going to be today. So this is just the most fantastic surprise that we could have today.
See, he even stole that from me. I was about to say that. He knows how my brain works, which is a dangerous thing. Anyway, Sam Wiles is with us. Sam is the host of Paul or Nothing, the Paul-centric podcast. I've been a guest on his show. He's been a guest on mine. He definitely has an opinion that's all his own, and that's why I like to have him on my show. Sam, welcome aboard.
What's going on, everyone? Thank you so much for having me here, Ken. To quote Dylan, this is a great turn of events for me as well. I'm really happy about this. Looking forward to talking some Beatles, which is something I don't normally get to do all that much on my show. It is mostly solo Paul stuff, so any excuse for hardcore Beatle chat is all, it's always relished.
And little did we know that Paul McCartney actually delivers newspapers to your house.
Yes, he's taking his time, but it'll get here eventually.
You know, he's in this band right now. They haven't broke big yet, so this is what he's doing for spare change.
I don't think any of the Beatles were newspaper boys, were they? I don't think I ever read that in the first 10th of tuning that I bothered to read.
So anyway, on the show Youngblood, I ask my guests a couple of questions, and from time to time the questions will vary. They won't always be the same, but because I liked the two that I had on the previous show, I'm going to repeat it for this one, which is, if you could have attended the recording sessions of any Beatles album from start to finish, which one would you pick and why? And the Beatles catalog is so fascinating from start to finish. How do you know what to pick? You could find, as many people do, their later stuff far more interesting, or you might want to go back to the early years when everything was new and exciting and they were breaking big. And maybe that's part of the reason why you want to hear a certain album and the sessions for that. And part two of this is asking you the same question. What solo Beatle album would you have liked to have attended the sessions for? Really unfair to only offer you one album when the solo Beatles catalog is enormous. I mean, if you want to mention a second, I won't say no. But for so many different reasons, you can find certain solo Beatles albums interesting. So we're going to get the perspective of a younger fan here on this show. And why don't we start with Skylar, and we'll ask you Beatles group.
All right.
Which
Beatles
album would you
first.
like to have attended the sessions for the most?
All right. So I chose the White Album for this one, and I think majority of us agree greatest double album of all time. At least that's what I think as well. So it's always been my number one favorite. It was one of the first two that I downloaded onto my phone when I was first starting to get into the Beatles, because the majority of the Beatles songs I knew were from that album. So I think just for nostalgic purposes, a trip down memory lane back to that first year as a fan, I would just want to see that whole masterpiece come together. And I also think that it was just such a chaotic time for the group, but they had such an endless amount of creativity. Like they had just gotten back from the India trip where a majority of these songs were written. And if I could just be in that studio and hear them chatting more about that trip and how those songs came together, I think that would be pretty cool. You know, and we kind of got a little taste of the India trip during Get Back. So now I'm kind of sitting here like, I want to know more. I want to hear them talk about it. I want that first witness. I want them to tell me everything that went down. And of course, this was their first double album that they did. So this was the most songs they had ever put out on an album before. So I feel like just witnessing that whole long recording process would be a very unique experience. And also they just had such a huge variety of sound. I think that it's their best album where they had all of that variety, because I feel like even like with Sgt. Pepper, it kind of all sounded the same, like it told a story in a way. So it kind of had that theme to it. Obviously the earlier stuff, it's kind of all that pop sound, like the whole "She Loves You," "I Want to Hold Your Hand from Me to You." So this is unlike anything I've heard before. And we also had Yoko starting to become a fresh face in the studio. You know, she had been in some sessions before, but this was the first time she was also really involved on the album because she was on 3 tracks. So I kind of want to see how that played out, if there was any like a huge amount of animosity, or if they were just kind of like thinking, all right, she's there, you know, we'll just deal with her. I want to see how they all interacted with one another. And I also want to kind of compare it to the Let It Be sessions, because we were able to witness that through the Get Back documentary. So I kind of want to witness how the White Album went too, because those albums were recorded almost back to back. The White Album was in '68, right before they went into Let It Be. So I kind of want to see if there was any difference in the way they acted, if any, because there's always been so much talk about how the White Album sessions, there was a lot of like bad blood, or there was a little bit of animosity, because that's when they were starting to drift apart from each other. But then again, we were kind of saying the same thing about Let It Be, because that's what we saw through Michael Lindsay Hogg's documentary. But with Get Back, it kind of almost seemed a little bit different. So I want to know, is it the truth with the White Album? Were they really like that going at each other that much, or is it not as bad as it seems?
Some very good points there. And I love what you just said, because about Get Back, there's always been this concern in the last few years about revisionism in the Beatles story. And even Paul himself said in the Paul Gambaccini interview that the White Album was the 10th album. And so you have a lot of tracks there on the White Album which didn't have all 4 of them. Some of them had 3, some had 2, some were just 1. And just to see how that all played out in the recording studio would have been fascinating, which songs were recorded pretty much the same time. Yeah, so you wonder, since we just witnessed Get Back, and it's very different from what we saw in Let It Be, and we did see the Beatles getting along in the studio, as well as their problems there as well. To me, it's a fuller and more accurate view of what happened during the Get Back, Let It Be sessions. Maybe what we've heard about the White Album, you know, maybe it wasn't as troubling a time.
Exactly.
We don't really know. Will we ever know the full truth?
I hope so. I know there's footage out there. So if there's anyone that's going to put together some kind of movie about it, you already got one viewer right here.
Okay.
I don't care if it's 2 hours. I don't care if it's 24 hours. I will watch all of it.
Oh, I don't think you'll be alone there.
I hope I have some good company right here that would agree with me.
Yeah.
Sign me up. I'm in.
Put it on Disney Plus. Let's do this.
All right, Sam, how about you? What Beatles album would you have liked to have witnessed the recording sessions for?
I hate to be really trite here, Ken. I hate to be really obvious, but I'm just going for the album that is my favorite, and I'm going to be going with Rubber Soul. I'd like to be there for the Rubber Soul sessions. It's the time when we really see the Beatles becoming a lot more mature and growing and kind of becoming the godlike Beatles that we know now, doing more serious topics and really trying to grow their sound and expand out there. It just seems like it'd be the more interesting period to witness, maybe just to see them go from, boys to men, as it were, and just the quality of songs on Rubber Soul and the variety and the sounds they achieve on that album would just be great to see be realized in real time. It's also one of those albums that we haven't had a 50th anniversary reissue of. I don't know this album as intensely. I don't know the sessions as well as I know everything from Pepper onwards, which is cemented in its own lore. I'd love to see all the unique interactions between the band at that time, how they were really working together as a group. Just like seeing if a bunch of stereotypes could be challenged, like was George pushed to the side and always sat on an amp somewhere just tuning his guitar, or was he really in there with the lads building these songs? I'd love to see that, especially at this early period. I'd also get to see Day Tripper and We Can Work It Out as well, because it's those sessions, so you'd get to see a great single be put together. It just seemed quite obvious to me. Also, it's when they started dabbling in drugs, so that'd be quite fun to see as well. I'm guessing I get to see more than just the sessions. I get to see them run off to the toilets and hide from George Martin. I definitely enjoy that. Indeed, pass it round, lads. Come on. But yeah, I wanted to do something really heady and intelligent and erudite, and I'm just going for my favorite album with my favorite songs. What I think is the most interesting point in the Beatles history, where there's just lots to absorb, a lot going on. I think it'll be really good first-hand experience. Maybe lean over to George Martin halfway through the sessions and just go, make sure you record everything from now on, just to help history along a little. But yeah, I'm going with Rubber Soul without question.
Okay, well, no one can argue what a great choice that is, and I think it's been said in a lot of the history books that even though every single Beatles album represented growth in the band as songwriters and as musicians, the first, I think, really big leap for them was with Rubber Soul.
Totally.
Going from help to that in terms of the lyrics, the maturity in the lyrics, not every song. Well, actually, you can go to Beatles for Sale with a lot of songs about troubling relationships, the first 3 songs on Beatles for Sale. But yeah, and all the different sounds that they were achieving in the studio. How do you guys feel about this? Actually, I should have said after Skylar made her comments about the White Album, if any of you wanted to comment on that, and you can also comment on Rubber Soul too. Before we get to you, Dylan, would you want to comment about the White Album or Rubber Soul?
Yeah, well, I'm very happy that you had me go last, because I had a list in my head in case someone had chosen my number one, what other ones I was going to say. And White Album and Rubber Soul were right there. Skylar couldn't have said it any better. I agree with absolutely everything that she said. It was the first, and not only was it the first Beatles album I heard, it was the first album that really opened my mind and changed my mindset to what music could be. It's the reason that I am who I am. It's the reason I'm here today. So it would be difficult for me not to want to pick the White Album. And then in terms of Rubber Soul, yeah, again, everything Sam said is correct. And then on top of that too, the only thing that I can add is that kind of to your point, Ken, that it was the biggest leap they made. It was, I think, the first time really that they were conscientiously focusing on the art of the album, not just having some singles and then a bunch of tracks, but having a really cohesive group of songs, from the beginning of side A to the end of side B, you know, it influenced Pet Sounds for a reason. I think that's really all that needs to be said. You know, and certainly before that, there were other albums by other artists that I think could kind of fit the mold of what you might want to call a concept album, but it was all sort of stuff like, you know, little Stevie Wonder sings Ray Charles and the Beach Boys go to the beach and stuff like that. And that stuff is all great, but to really focus on the art of songwriting and to come up with songs like Girl and I'm Looking Through You and Norwegian Wood and You Won't See Me and Nowhere Man. I mean, it's undeniable. I mean, I couldn't have said it any better.
Yeah. Okay. I want to say one thing about the White Album, and when I had Skylar on before on my show, I know I like to bring it up all the time on my programs, that the White Album to me is the most diverse album there's ever been in the history of music. And in many ways, not only do I love it because the songs are great, but that really influenced my musical tastes to accept so many different musical genres. And you don't realize that when you're a little kid. You know, you're just throwing all this music that you grow to love, and then later on, yeah, I like stuff like Honey Pie and When I'm 64 and dance hall tunes, and I can get into Revolution Number 9 and avant-garde stuff, but I can get into blues music like Your Blues, you know, or something like that. Oh,
and to that point too, I think the White Album is such a great case study in truly the art of the album. You know, my friend was telling me the other day that, you know, he had made a you know, his ranking of the Beatles albums, and what he had done was he ranked all the individual songs and then he figured out, you know, the average by each song. And by doing that, the White Album came on his list at number 8. And he's like, yeah, I just feel weird about that. But, you know, there's just the songs I don't love, like Good Night or Honey Pie or things like that. And I can understand, you know, not loving those individual songs as much, but to me, there's such an integral part of the listening experience that is the White Album. You know, I might not throw on Wild Honey Pie in and of itself, but I absolutely want to hear it there at track 5. You know, it's got to be there. It's part of the experience. And, you know, I think we're in an age where that art of sequencing and the art of the album, I wouldn't say it's getting lost, but certainly in the age of iTunes, where you can pick and choose what songs you want to hear and put them all in playlists and shuffle stuff, that stuff is all great, you know, for its own reasons. But I don't know. I think that is such a magical part of, you know, that record in particular, and that whole era of music making that might get a little lost today every now and then.
I kind of want to add on to what I said before, how I was talking about how the White Album, maybe not so much of a concept album, but I feel like it is in a way. It might not be as direct as Sgt. Pepper, where it all sounded the same, but the White Album still tells that story of where the band was in that time. It's just a very extra long edition. And yeah, it might not all go together, because you go from hearing Helter Skelter to Long, 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 or then you got Wild Honey Pie thrown in the mix, and then Revolution 9 at the end. And you're kind of thinking, oh my God, what are they trying to say? But it's their story and it's there. They're not going to come out and say it's a concept album. It's kind of something you have to figure out for yourself.
I don't want to miscredit it, but it might have been Robert Rodriguez who said he viewed it as a concept album where the concept is just Western music, you know, the history of Western music, if you will. For my apologies if it was someone else who said that and they're watching this, but
in some ways, to me, it's a concept album because it's saying that everything we do is the Beatles, and it doesn't matter whether or not what style of music each song is, or whether you just have one Beatle alone, like Julia or Blackbird, or all 4 of them together. It's still the Beatles, no matter, you know, how you skin the cat. It's still a Beatles album. And I just wanted to question you about Sgt. Pepper there, Skylar, because you said that like every song sounds the same. You mean sonically? Because stylistically, there's a lot of differences.
Yeah, no, sonically, yeah, because it kind of has that like psychedelic, almost kind of like, for lack of a better word, kind of like circus atmosphere a little bit, because that's what it feels like when you're entering, and then when you're leaving, it kind of has that same sound all throughout.
Okay.
What?
Anything you want to add to, Sam?
was going to say, what I love so much about the White Album is that I don't spoil myself on it as much as I do the other ones. And putting it on start to finish in that proper old-fashioned, you listen to this in a certain sequence and you're going to be possibly told a story or possibly told a narrative, is still the most exciting for me. Been listening to that album for like 16 years by this point and it still feels so fresh and exciting, and you never quite perfectly remember the order and you're always so happy when a certain song comes on. I'd probably argue it might be, in its own weird way, the best album to introduce someone to the Beatles to. I don't know if anyone would feel that would be the same.
Introduced me to them.
Yeah, you know.
I was 8 years old and my dad decided that I was ready for Revolution 9 and Helter Skelter. So if it's not too late to call Child Protective Services,
and then
I
you
can give you his
become
address.
naked.
You have a very liberal-minded father there, I think.
My folks are pretty
For
cool.
our benefit.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, well, you know, one of the things that I like to say about the Beatles catalog is that, because here I am doing radio shows where I mix it all together, so you're hearing individual songs being placed between Beatles and solo, different years, different decades. And to me, the strength of the catalog is that as individual songs, they all work. But then you can get lost in this, what happened to the album as a concept. You know, every time that you hear With Little Help from My Friends, do you have to hear Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds in your head after that? It does exist on its own as a great song, you know? So it works both ways as individual songs and as great albums. And even in the case of the White Album, I think maybe it's from all the years of hearing it, the songs flow so well together.
Quote Paul McCartney, you know, look, it was good, it sold, it's the Beatles' bloody White Album, shut up.
I mean, it's very difficult for me to hear Bungalow Bill or While My Guitar Gently Weeps without the other, you know, simply because of the hey-oh, boom, goes right into the start of it. Like that to me, they have to go together.
Same with Back in the USSR and Dear Prudence.
And Dear Prudence.
It sounds weird without the two back to back.
Completely agree.
So if you listen to my radio show and I'm playing Back in the USSR and I'm not going to follow that with Dear Prudence, you're going to run to your record collection and bring out Dear Prudence.
You're going to mess with my mind a little bit if you do that.
Port you to the FCC.
You won't be the first.
I love how the solution there was to go and get a record rather than just, you know, use any other more convenient technology.
Dylan, what would be your pick? And you know, if it happens to be the same,
change it.
No,
broadcasting, come on.
No, I prepared for this because I did think heavily on both of those records. And I also thought quite heavily on Abbey Road, almost for the sole reason of, you know, we all just experienced Get Back, and there's sort of that insatiable desire to see like what came next. You know, you see the seeds of them breaking up in Get Back, but there's so much more to happen after that. But I ultimately went with Revolver. And again, I think there's a case to be made for all of the albums, but I went with Revolver for both musical reasons and personal reasons. On a personal level, certainly understanding how close they were at the time to finishing their touring careers and kind of wanting to get inside their heads. You know, certainly they had just made their biggest advance going from Help to Rubber Soul. They are arguably making just as big a leap while dealing with, I think, even more intense pressure and intense issues. You know, that is a big decision to make, you know, to not be on the road anymore. And then, you know, not that there weren't things before this, but you're starting to see some internal issues, like there being a disconnect for a minute between, you know, John and George, who have experienced their LSD trip, and Ringo, who eventually does too, and Paul, who still hasn't at the time, which, you know, leads to him walking out during the She Said sessions because, you know, there's, you know, some philosophical disagreement going on there. And, you know, it's certainly not to the level of anything that happens presumably during the White Album or the Get Back sessions, but, you know, some more very, very like hairline fractures, if not cracks, are, kind of starting to take place. But then musically, not just because you have Eleanor Rigby and She Said, and For No One, and Andrew Bird Can Sing, and Tomorrow Never Knows, but you have a new engineer in Jeff Emmerich, who is helping to revolutionize the way, not just that their records sound, but that records in general sound. All of a sudden, you've got the bass and drums being more present than they were at any other point in the catalog. And you hear it right off the bat with Taxman. Ringo's drums and Paul's bass are front and center and kicking you in the face in a way that they didn't at any other point. And that maintains its way throughout the rest of the album. I think it's one of Paul's greatest albums as a bassist and one of Ringo's greatest records as a drummer. And part of that is the way they are recorded. And you hear that as well. Sam was saying, if you get to see Rubber Soul, you get to see Day Trip and Work It Out. We Can Work It Out. With Revolver, you get to see Paperback Writer and Rain. And certainly the bass and drum work on both of those songs is famous for a reason. You get the introduction of tape loops to the sound, with Tomorrow Never Knows being the first song recorded for the sessions. You're just getting a lot of musical and creative innovation taking place. Again, that they've been making strides the last few albums, but for all of the, I think, clout that Pepper has for its leap forward, and it certainly deserves so much of it, but a lot of it is already there in the Revolver sessions. People, because it's considered a part of the, people think of 62 to 66 and 66 to 70, and Revolver is still in 66. So people look at it as early Beatles, but to me it's a very distinct mid-period, if you will. And a lot of the stuff you're starting to hear, or a lot of the stuff you hear on Pepper, you're starting to hear on Revolver, and that's Jeff Emmerich. That is, I think, even more of a focus put on creating this group of songs, this cohesive group of songs into the album. I just think it's an unbelievably fascinating time for the group personally and musically. So that was my number one choice.
Okay. Before I share my thoughts, let me hear what the two of you thought of what Dylan just said about Revolver.
I like that you looped it into the mid Beatles period, how like people usually think of like early and late, but I think there is that mid period. And I think Rubber Soul kind of falls into that too, because you're starting to hear a little bit of that transition on there. So I just wanted to give you props for that. And also that Revolver, I always used to think Revolver was overrated, guilty. But now I feel like with age, I've just started to appreciate it more. I'm starting to appreciate the mid period and even a little bit of the earlier stuff as well. So Revolver, I'd put up there on my list as well.
On a personal note, it's the first one I ever heard. My friend put it on an old iPod Nano for me. I was in Mrs. Snyer's art room doing my coursework, and then suddenly 1, 2, 3, 4 came on, and here we are today. But that's, the rest is history.
It's funny to me, I feel like when I talk to people about their favorite Beatles records, I hear a lot of people argue for Sgt. Pepper. I hear a lot of people argue for Abbey Road. I hear a lot of people argue for the White Album. And I feel like when everyone's talking about it, so many people are like, but Revolver's right there. So I have an ongoing joke with my friends that Revolver is everybody's second favorite Beatles record. I think as a listening experience, it's way up there for me. I absolutely adore it. But even though a lot of the when we think about the turbulence of 66, John saying that the Beatles are bigger than Jesus, everything that happens while they're on tour, that comes after the sessions, sure, but those feelings and that sort of vibe of uncertainty is already there. And I think it would be really interesting. I mean, they record the entirety of that record and then they go on tour, and Paperback Writer is the only song from the sessions that they play. And I'm pretty sure, and I could be wrong on this, I'm sure we'll get a bunch of comment saying actually, but I'm pretty sure that they still had some dates after the album was released. I'm pretty sure the album was released in August of '66, and they continued touring through that month. So, but even after it was released, they weren't playing anything from it. And granted, you know, yeah, how are they going to pull off Eleanor Rigby? How are they going to pull off Tomorrow Never Knows? But I don't see why they couldn't have done I Want to Tell You live. I don't see why they couldn't have done And Your Bird Can Sing. There's quite a few songs they easily could have done. But Dr. Robert, but I think they were already in that headspace of this is an album for us. You know, this is an album that's going to exist here and nowhere else. So I don't know. I think that aspect of it is very, very fascinating.
Well,
Probably also a little afraid of what the audience might think of the new sound, because they were already so used to early Beatles, and they thought, okay, I don't know if we want to do like a hardcore transition into all of that. We should maybe just play what they want to hear.
that's
Sure.
very possible. It's nice to see in recent years the appreciation for that middle period of Rubber Soul and Revolver, which I really think has gone up in stature. I wish that I could say the same thing for the earlier stuff, but definitely I see more people appreciating Rubber Soul and Revolver. And I do feel like there's been a big change ever since the CDs first came out in 1987, because if you were brought up on the American albums, you would have had 3 less tracks for Revolver.
All John tracks too. The American Revolver only has 2 John tracks, which is insane because his work on that album is miraculous. I mean, his songwriting, Paul's songwriting, and George's songwriting on that. George has 3 songs, I think, all of which are incredible in their own way. And then, you know, John is writing Tomorrow Never Knows, and, you know, She Said, and Your Bird Can Sing. And I'm not sure if to this day Paul has ever written a better lyric than For No One. You know, he's written so many amazing lyrics, but when I look back at For No One, I'm like, this is Dylan level. It's unbelievable.
Oh, he's written some great lyrics. That's definitely one of his best.
Yeah.
I also think, as much as I love Yellow Submarine, you know, if that's the only song that's being chosen as a single from the album, you're not getting, you know, a full taste of what that album's all about and the experimentation. Though there are a lot of sound effects in Yellow Submarine and all, but, you know, I don't think that AM radio would have accepted Tomorrow Never Knows at the time, something as wild as that. But, you know, you're still dealing with a time when, well, it was different in America because we had a different concept of singles and albums. And, you know, they could have released, you know, Got to Get You Into My Life as a single.
That would have been
That's
so
the
big.
obvious one.
Yeah.
That's the obvious one for me.
It went top 10 in the US when it was released as a single in 1976.
Yep.
You know, I should point out, though, that Eleanor Rigby was the flip side of Yellow Submarine, and that got airplay too. But still, I don't think that AM radio got the full flavor, you know, of how expansive this album was and how creative, you know, the Beatles were getting at this point. But yeah, I'm very happy to see Revolver being way up the chain now, and as far as favorites, there are some fans who rate it #1 now.
I mean,
part
which
of
is
it
totally.
might be Sgt. Pepper fatigue. So
I look at what I might consider like my top 6, and like they could all be my favorite on any given day. But to me, there's not, you know, the Yellow Submarine album is obviously kind of its own little curio, but, you know, discounting that, if I think of my least favorite, quote unquote, I mean, it might be With the Beatles, but I like every single song on With the Beatles. I mean, and it's, you know, we're talking about this mid period and the early period, but I almost view like, well, what do you consider the earlier period? Because to me, A Hard Day's Night is a very different record than Please Please Me and With the Beatles. I mean, there's a Miraculous League there. And then I almost view it as its own thing. And then Beatles for Sale and Help are kind of their own thing. And, you know, people lump it in 2 sections, but I think there's like 5 or 6. So.
Well, I've done a couple of shows on my podcast where I question my co-hosts every time that there's a Beatles album on the charts. It's always the later Beatles. You will never see anything pre Sgt. Pepper unless it's represented on the Beatles one. and then I question my co-host why that is. And I remember in the past being sent emails that early Beatles music sounds dated, whereas the later stuff still sounds contemporary, as if that should matter anyway. And I don't even agree with that comment, but yeah, I would like to see more love given to the early Beatles stuff too, whatever you consider early.
Yeah. I actually, I'm pretty sure that I sent you a message about that after one of the things we said today shows, and my thought process on it. And I want to preface this by saying that I absolutely adore all of the early Beatles stuff. I mean, if I ever gravitate towards some of the later stuff, it never has anything to do with a lack of love for it. And A Hard Day's Night for me is in that top 6 that I have. But for me, I think the difference, I think there's two things. I think there's a large misconception. People have heard it repeated before, like, that before Rubber Soul or even before Pepper, they were just a pop band or they were a boy band or whatever. And that's when they got serious. And so people hear that and they parrot it, even though they don't know what they're talking about. They don't take the time to, look into it. But I also do think that with the releases of Revolver and Pepper, those records, I think, came out at a time where the entire counterculture was changing, and you can view that period of history, and that period of history informs so much of where we're at in the world today. If you look at where so many people think about things socially, politically, anything else, a lot of it starts there in the mid to late 60s. So that work is viewed as more important. And it is certainly, from an objective standpoint, what they were doing musically on those records is more intricate than the early records. But I think that people, are more likely to gravitate towards something that they can relate to more. And I think when you listen to music today, even with how much music has changed, you're more likely to hear that quote unquote Beatles influence with stuff that sounds like, the White Album. If you listen to Elliott Smith, there's so much here that's like, oh, this is really White Album-y. Or you listen to Oasis and it's like, oh, these guys have listened to Magical Mystery Tour a few times. You might not hear as much of that coming from A Hard Day's Night or Beatles for Sale. So I think that's why there tends to be such a gravitational pull towards that later stuff. But that all being said, I don't think any of that should discount how important the early stuff is and how great it all is too. But that's just how I view it.
Yeah. And there was innovation from the very beginning.
Absolutely.
And it's very easy to not realize that, because it all sounds like, pop music to them, simple lyrics, but there's so much that's going on in the way songs are arranged, Paul's bass playing on certain songs, certain chord progressions that were very different, in the early years. It didn't all just start in 65 or 66. So yeah. All right.
Completely.
Why don't we move on to the solo catalog? And Sam, I think I'll start with you.
I was just going to say, before I go on to my solo choice, I probably should have picked the Beatles 1, because that would have given me a great spread of sessions, actually. I should have thought tactically about this, not emotionally. But we are going to go with my emotional Paul McCartney choice, though. Again, this is arguably my favourite album of his, but coincidentally, I mean, you can say this about all Paul McCartney recording sessions, but it's from a very interesting part of his life as well. I'm going to go with Paul McCartney's McCartney 2 from 1980, recorded in 79 during the fallow period for Wings, just before the breakup, just before the Japan bust. Marijuana certainly links both of these albums, I guess. But yeah, this is the birth of modern solo Paul, the Paul that I love the most. I also adore the fact that he just basically set up his own home studio with the help of Eddie Klein twice over, moving this incredible magic making machine to different properties with him. And the music made during those sessions is just the most inventive and creative he's ever done, as far as I'm concerned. It is the continuation of that homespun, warm, homely McCartney 1 do-it-yourself attitude, but I hate to use this phrase, it's a very overused phrase, but it takes it to the next level. And McCartney 2 is everything I desire from a Paul album. It just sounds like him. It is him. It is just Paul. There's no one else. He's unfiltered. It's self-indulgent. It goes on too long. So some of the songs are far too strange. Some of the songs don't quite fit. And yet it all comes together to make an indescribable experience. This is really a useless exercise trying to describe McCartney 2. You just kind of have to make people watch it. I also enjoy it as an introductory album for McCartney as well. This is my go-to album if I'm ever at a social gathering and I try to trick people into listening to some solo Paul. This is where I take my Paul from, because this still sounds shockingly contemporary. You know, not only has he predicted the 1980s, which is something that's often said about this album, he kind of predicted the rest of it as well, right up until now. There are still artists who, I mean, again, to quote Dylan, there are a lot of artists from the last 40 years and you go, oh, they like McCartney too. It's throughout the culture. It's very it's just so present. And to be there with Paul up in Sussex or up in Scotland, seeing him bang on the drum in the toilet, and the birth of Check My Machine and the whole idea, and seeing how these crazy futuristic techno synth-based songs relate to the gorgeous countryside around and what was really going on there. I mean, first and foremost, this is one of the most undocumented, unspecified periods in McCartney's history, because it's when he just started off to Scotland and there was no one there. Eddie Klein popped by for a couple of days and that's about it. There is no Lewis and I peering in and seeing what exactly is going on during this time. I'm not saying the entire album would be explained in some beautiful Deus Ex Machina sort of way, but I think an album that really doesn't make sense would start to make a lot more sense. But then again, maybe I don't want to make it make more sense.
I'm finding everything you're saying fascinating, Sam. And I'm sure a lot of people might think Paul would be very interesting with a band, or with other musicians, instead of just doing everything all by himself. But there is something to be said about watching him do the entire process and playing every single instrument and playing around with sound effects and synthesizers and whatnot. And, a lot of the stuff on McCartney 2 does sound very contemporary. And there are a lot of fans out there that wish that Paul would just do whatever the hell he wants in the studio and not care about whether it sells or not. And if it's experimental, fine. And they kind of appreciate when he goes in that direction, instead of the, if you want to call it, traditional McCartney album, if there is such a thing. But yeah, and you certainly seem to be in that category of a fan that wants him to do something different, not what's expected.
Oh, don't get me wrong. I would also have loved to have been there for Rock Down as well, to see McCartney 3, the third sibling, be done in a very similar way. But of course, seeing early Wings in 72 would be really cool. Seeing them take all that live material and start to do something with it for Red Rose Speedway, and you can do it for every single album. Oh, do I want to go to Lagos to see Band on the Run? Do I want to go to America with Venus and Mars? Like, there would never be a point where it wouldn't be interesting. I mean, seeing him and Hugh Padgham argue during the Press to Play sessions. Did you write yesterday? No, I did. To see that would be great. Him and Costello in '89. The Driving Rain period, we spoke about that off air earlier. Just to see him in that post Linda newly introduced Heather world, that'd be fascinating. And it wasn't released, but I'd love to see the Rupert the Bear sessions as well. One of my obsessions is that unreleased Rupert the Bear album, and to peek in and just watch Paul read about 12 books and 12 annuals of Rupert the Bear, I think would be a fun time.
I don't know. I think Rupert the Bear might see its release. I mean, I could see it fitting in with London Town. It's in that kind of period.
Back to the Edge, yes.
Yeah.
Better
Very
be.
good. Dylan, you want to comment on what Sam had to say?
Yeah, well, I'm upset because I thought that I was going to be talking with a different group of people today. And had I known that Sam was going to be here, I would not have prepared to also choose McCartney 2 as my choice, which again, thankfully I have a backup, but I'm upset that he stole my thunder. But I will, the only thing I'll add on to it, well, two things really, I think, to piggyback off what, Sam was saying about how influential it's been. They just came out with that thing for his 80th birthday where it was, 80 artists choose their favorite McCartney songs. And it was so interesting and fascinating to me to see how many people chose Temporary Secretary and Waterfalls. And, I think Waterfalls kind of got a bit of a bump because it was featured in the Rick Rubin documentary. And Temporary Secretary over the last few years has kind of had its resurgence a little bit. So there's that. I think that's a very strong point. And then also, this is not at all a comment on the quality of any other Paul record, but I do think, and this also isn't a bad thing or a good thing, I think it just is what it is. Paul is someone who is very in tune with what people want and what people are thinking and what people are saying. And I think he cares about that. And certainly before McCartney 2, you saw an attempt with Back to the Egg, what I think is a very obvious attempt for at least half of the album to be like, okay, let's go a little harder edged here. There is more punk, there is more new wave, and hey, I'm Paul, I can do that too. And you've seen it with so many other albums. You hear certain songs or certain whole albums worth where you're like, okay, I see what he's trying to do here, whether or not you think it's successful. But I do think there is something to be said for, and for me, the fascination is, what is it like when this guy goes to screw off all by himself, with a boatload of dynamite weed in a cabin where nobody can get in touch with him, and he doesn't care so much about that stuff. I mean, to me, I don't think that necessarily makes it more like honest or anything like that, because I think that Paul is on, I think it is a part of his personality and his honest creativity to want to create something that appeals to a lot of people. But it is equally as fascinating and honest to make something that he's just interested in himself. And Paul creates, I think, a lot of his best music when he's either up against a wall or he's being pushed a little bit. With McCartney 2, I feel like there maybe isn't as much of that, but you're coming off 2 records, London Town and Back to the Egg, that didn't go to number 1, which for Paul McCartney is a failure. Never mind the fact that they were both top 10 records.
Mhm.
The fact that they weren't number 1 albums, that's a failure, and we don't know exactly how he's feeling about Wings at the time. And, I think that, to me, I would absolutely love to see, I know what the songs sound like, but how did he get there? Did he come up with those loops in Temporary Secretary because he was just so frustrated and mashing random keys and that's what came out? Or was it more of a very precise, like, nope, I'm bored and I'm stoned and I have nothing else to do today, so I'm gonna really, go all in on this? I think there's so many different ways it could have gone. So that's why I was gonna choose McCartney 2, but I will choose something else. But I would love to hear any of Skylar's thoughts if she has any.
I mean, really, it's just piggybacking off of both of you. It's that mystery and that intriguing thing where we don't know exactly what was going through his head, and we crave that. Like, we want to know what's going on. But at the same time, I kind of do like the mystery, because then it leaves it up to our interpretation and our imagination, thinking, okay, we believe what we want to, and we can say, hey, he probably wrote this song because of that. And I mean, the only person who can tell us right or wrong is Paul. And will he ever? We don't know. But I kind of like the mystery, and I see where you both are getting at.
I do think one other thought I just had was, if you look at the session tapes, I don't think it's an accident that the earliest stuff he recorded is kind of the strangest and most out there stuff, and the very last thing he recorded is Coming Up, which is, unless you want to talk about like One of These Days and Waterfalls as more accessible because they're ballads, I think coming up is easily the most accessible as it pertains to like something that could be on the radio, even though it is still very strange and the soundscape isn't really like anything else. So I do think it would be interesting to see, like, was there a moment for him where he's messing around and doing all the stuff where he realizes, like, maybe I could make something, even if it is just like, well, I'll make some more accessible stuff that I can then hash out with a band later, even if he truly did never have intentions to release it as it was. I don't think it's a mistake that you start with your, all you horse riders and whatnot, and then end with your coming up. But, Skylar, again, a fantastic point. Like maybe it is best to leave some of it a mystery, but that wouldn't make this discussion any fun. So
it's
but
funny
we
how
don't even know if Paul really analyzes himself, to that degree that we know why he does everything he does in this fashion, but some really good points here. I love hearing the DIY albums because everything that you hear obviously is Paul playing, but it's everything that's in his head.
Mm-hmm.
There are no contributions from another musician. It's all what he's hearing in his ears. So you're getting the fullest representation of his ideas coming to fruition. And whether you like them or not, it's a fascinating thing to watch. And if you can learn more about the process, better for all of us. But
and I certainly think too, my last point, because I'm talking way too much here and I apologize for that, is that I do think it's fascinating when you think about everything else he then created in the 80s. You think of some of these big emotional, very produced ballads, No More Lonely Nights, Through Our Love, which are songs I thoroughly enjoy, and I love that they're as produced as they are. But then I listen to a song like Waterfalls and I'm like, this is so perfect as it is. And I don't think I would like this song as much if it got that treatment. I think it's such a delicate song that it deserves the more delicate production. Or even a song like On the Way, which is such a great swanky blues. And like when he was recording Tug of War and Pipes of Peace, if he was trying to do On the Way, would he think like, okay, well, I'm going to get some horns to do some jump blues stuff on this? Like, I don't think that would have worked as well. And I think it works so perfectly for what it is. And certainly, you're hearing everything that he's thinking, but without the convenience of having, George Martin and the full studio and all the session musicians. And so it doesn't discount anything on any other record from the 80s, but it creates such a singular thing that even though it's a similar process to McCartney and McCartney 3, it's still unlike anything else. And I think that's what's so fascinating about it.
Yeah, sometimes I think it can come down to what you hear first. If you've heard On the Way and it's a George Martin produced recording of On the Way and it's on Tug of War, you might love it just that way. And then you'll hear a more bare version on McCartney 2 and say, well, it needs a little work here. It all depends.
Sure.
Like the order in which you hear things can affect your opinion of how you like these songs best.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Why don't we get Skylar's choice and then we'll move on to Dylan. Solo Beatles album you would have liked to have witnessed the recording sessions for?
So immediately my mind started going to John's discography because obviously he's my favorite and I could easily pick a favorite album from there. But after some good thought on it, I actually picked McCartney 3. Sam, I know you were talking about that.
Wow.
So I picked that album because that was the second Paul album release that I was actually in the fandom for. And it was highly anticipated, something to complete the trilogy. And obviously it had been recorded during early 2020, prime time for COVID. And I think it's just so funny that when we were in that period, everyone kind of had their little quarantine projects, because we have all this free time. Everyone thinks, I'm going to get back to doing this hobby because I love that. Or, hey, I want to start doing this. And so it's so funny to see that even a Beatle is kind of participating in that. He's just continuing to do what he loves, putting out the music, keeping up with that. And I also love how it wasn't even intended to be an album. And Paul didn't know that either. We didn't know we were going to get it. He didn't know that we were going to get it. And he said during that time, it was all about just making music for yourself rather than doing it, you know, as a job. And he even performed all the instruments himself. So really, he was doing it all for himself. And then all of a sudden you end up with this beautiful masterpiece to complete the trilogy. And it just, I feel like it's just very fitting in that way. And I feel like if it weren't for COVID, we probably wouldn't have gotten it. Or maybe we would have gotten some songs mixed in with others that he would have recorded over the past couple years. We don't know how it would have turned out. And I feel like if I was there, I would kind of want to have a little Q&A with him, you know, while he's working, because he's doing all of this himself. He's got no one else around. I kind of want to say, hey, Paul, can you explain, you know, this technical thing to me? Can you explain that? Because, you know, I wouldn't know left from right if I was in the studio with him. And I feel like he wouldn't have had anyone else in there with him, because obviously quarantine, isolation, you know, you couldn't have been around people. So I feel like the two of us alone in the studio, you know, that's more than I could ever dream of right now. And it would have been such an amazing opportunity.
Yeah, you know, bouncing off of what you just said, when McCartney 2 came out, Paul said that when he was first recording it, he wasn't quite sure that it was going to be his next album. He didn't really know. And then friends around him said, I guess that's your next album. And then he said, well, I guess it is then. So it wasn't like, oh, we have a guest here. One cool cat.
Gatsby loves McCartney 3.
Okay.
Thanks, Gatsby.
Yeah, I love everything.
It's funny
you
that
just
there's
said.
that pattern.
What's that?
It's funny that there's that pattern, how he felt that same way about McCartney 2, and then McCartney 3, he's just thinking, oh, look, I've got an album. Here you go.
Yeah, I mean, some of these songs, you never know, could have been on the next album with his band of the last 20 years. For all you know, we don't know. I'd love to know everything that went into Deep Deep Feeling. What a
That's one of my
complex
favorites.
piece of work that was. Oh God, he just kept piling more and more ideas on. I don't know if he knows when to edit, but I still love it the way it is.
Yeah,
But,
the instrumentals are great on that album.
oh yeah, I like when Paul does instrumentals a lot. You know, the first track on there, the 2 that are on McCartney 2, I love. You know, your comments?
You're muted, Sam.
I'm muted. Sorry about that. It's important to remember as well that it's not just every time he has unused songs he creates an album. Like, for example, we had all the Phil Ramone stuff in the 80s. So these are still thought about and are very special to a certain extent, because there's also the untold hundreds of other songs that he's just written at home. And you know, I'm sure there's 10 more albums he could have just chosen to put out at any point in history. And I think they are a lot more special because of that. Like, he is still somewhat able to recognize that, okay, I've actually got a good bunch of songs here now, let's just put it out. And he's been 3 for 3 so far. He's very good at it, I'd say.
It would be nice.
Yeah, that's
Sorry.
an excellent point, because, and a lot of the stuff they did with Phil Ramone or David Foster, some of that can fall into that category of experimental stuff. You know, I Love This House, you know, something like that, which is kind of a wacky track, which for years and years just sits being unreleased until it's a bonus track on a CD single, you know, so good point there.
Yeah. Oh, and yeah, I completely agree with what you just said, Sam. And I think that aspect of it does make it that much more special. And you have to imagine that he feels the same way, which makes it even more curious as to why he played one song from it a few times on his most recent tour. And, you know, with all due respect, you know, Women and Wives isn't my favorite song on the record. If I saw him do it live, I'd be so stoked. But with all due respect to Women and Wives, like, you have Find My Way and Slidin', 2 songs that are tailor-made for live performance, one of which has 2 members of the touring band already on it. And it's mind-boggling to me why he chose one of the slowest, dirgiest song, you know, to play live and then drop out. But like, he has to, you know, and he puts so much work into it with all the different, you know, between 3 Imagine and just all the different final copies and everything. And he just, I don't know. It makes me mad, but Skylar, I think it's such an awesome choice on a couple levels. It's probably the smartest choice because it's also implying that you would get to spend your entire COVID lockdown hanging out with Paul McCartney.
Exactly. You wouldn't any other way.
Which, you know, if we're taking this seriously, like realistically, if we're going back and we're seeing all the Revolver sessions, you know, Sam is saying, oh, it would be nice to then hang out with them outside and stuff too. But realistically, it's like, no, you probably just get to go to the studio when they're at the studio. But if that's the case, you're just hanging out with Paul at his house and you can't go anywhere else. It's COVID. So firstly, very intelligent. And secondly, yeah, I think that I think it's a wonderful choice because it fulfills a lot of the same, you know, things as McCartney too. But I also do think, you know, when I was thinking about what album I wanted to choose for this exercise, you know, it's so easy to think about the obvious choices, your Band on the Run, your All Things Must Pass, because, you know, the cultural relevance that they have and the stories behind them. But I do think that it's important to continue to keep up with, you know, what the two remaining members are doing, because for as long as they live, everything they do is a part of the Beatles story. The Beatles story doesn't end when they break up in 1970. You know, you have 4 ongoing stories throughout 1980, and then you have 3 more through 2001, and then you have 2 more continuing to today until the day that both of them die. It's a part of the greater story. I truly believe that, and I truly feel that. And for everything that Paul has been through, and you hear it in some of the songs in McCartney 3, you hear aspects of, you know, at least I do. I think of Seize the Day when I hear that bridge. You know, I bless the day that you came into my life, and I can finally roll back the blinds. Like, he might be talking about Nancy, or he might be talking about Linda, but it can easily apply to both, and those are 2 very important aspects of his life. If Lavatory Lil is who a lot of people think it's about, you know, that's a part of his life. And hearing him, you know, my favorite song, Pretty Boys, and Sam's favorite song, you know, Pretty Boys, very, very much to me is a Beatles song. You know, the Beatles were the Pretty Boys. They were treated, you know, and there's a whole video that I think they clipped out when we did the McCartney 3 song rankings on the 2 Leg Show. I think they clipped out my defense of Pretty Boys and made it its own video. But I think the word choice I used was, you know, they were viewed by so many people as these shallow commodities. Like, look, you know, let's make these Beatle wigs and let's make these Beatle pins, and we're gonna make, you know, they're the new big thing. And you look throughout history, and you know, James Dean was treated like that. You know, so many other people have been treated like that. You know, I think he said that song was inspired by, you know, I forget his name, but the photographer who took pictures of them in the early days. But there's a little bit of his whole life throughout that album that he's recording when he's 77 and 78 years old. And I think that's extremely, extremely important, regardless of your feelings on the album. So I think it's a phenomenal choice.
And even on a personal note with Pretty Boys, I've always considered it a Beatles-esque song solely because of that lyric, "Here come the pretty boys, they're gonna set your world on fire." And the minute I heard that, I just thought, that's the Beatles. Like, they are those pretty boys. They set my world on fire. And I'm sitting there thinking, oh, that's them. That's
I'm glad to know that there are 3 people here present that recognize that is a great song, while Sam is over here. I can't
keep silent anymore. I'm sorry. This is not true.
Come on, Sam.
Sam, the fact that you defend Deep Down, which is
the
not
best song
even
on the album.
No,
I love that song.
Okay, you can love it all you want, but it is barely even a composition, and there's not half as much work put into it as Pretty Boys.
Some people don't want to get deep down.
The instrumentals, that whole album, it's the instrumentals for me. And to me,
those synth horns really do it for me. I completely agree with you.
Yeah.
Also, I just want to say, I do not count Let's Change the World as a continuing part of the Beatles story. Let's just get that.
I'm sorry you feel that way, Sam.
I'll hold my
when
comments.
The clock strikes 1.
Well, let me just add a few things if I can remember everything that you both said there, Skylar and Dylan. Good point about Women and Wives. I thought that was a poor choice to do live. When you're playing in front of a stadium or an arena, you don't want to do a slow song or a ballad that most people don't know, even if you love the song. You know, it's got to be something either more recognizable or it's got to be a rocker or something up tempo. So definitely I thought Find My Way. And yeah, Sliding would work very well as a live song. Yeah, I love all the comments you said about McCartney 3. There's a never-ending debate, and I don't, we could say this for another show, but very often on my podcast shows, I talk about songs that I think are not great compositions. Songs that only have a few lines of lyrics, going back to Why Don't We Do It in the Road? Or That Would Be Something, or Cosmically Conscious. You know, that to me, a lot more work could have been put into the composition, but there are things that attract you to those recordings. What Paul adds to them, the sound of his voice, the bass playing, the drumming, how everything is mixed. And you can appreciate the recordings on that level. And there are certain songs like Deep Down, which to me is not really, you know, a great composition, but you love the sounds on it. You love the production behind it. So yeah, what really matters? Is it the composition that matters? Lyrics and melody, although we love instrumentals too, or everything that you bring to the table with the recording?
What matters is the feeling that it elicits.
Okay, so then you don't have to have the greatest composition.
Oh, I mean, there's a bunch of McCartney songs that are arguably even less of a composition than Deep Down. I just like needling Sam about that one.
You be careful, boy. You be careful.
It's also important, just like no matter what he produces, it's whether or not the fans can relate to it in some way or they can find themselves in a song. And if you got that, then that's what matters.
Yeah.
Right.
I often feel like I'm going to get Deep Down and I'm going to do it right. Yeah.
There you go.
Party every night. Why not?
And we were talking about the White Album, and you know, is Wild Honey Pie a great composition? But it fits the whole way that everything threads together. So it has its own purpose. Like Why Don't We Do It in the Road has a purpose. Anyway, any final comments here about these selections? I think they've all been great. They really caught me by surprise in a way. I actually wasn't expecting McCartney 2 or McCartney 3 here. So
should I give mine?
Just
I thought
before
you
do,
did. Wasn't McCartney 3 your choice?
Well, McCartney 2 was going to be my choice, but I had a backup, but it's fine. McCartney 2 can be.
No, you can mention another one, because you talked a lot about McCartney 3. I thought that was your choice.
Yeah, I talk a lot in general, which I'm sure that your viewers here are just finding extremely charming and not annoying whatsoever. And I think my wife is probably very thankful that she's not home to be listening to this right now.
You're knowledgeable. You got to spread the knowledge.
That's right.
Don't think of it as an annoyance.
We'll go with knowledgeable. I appreciate that.
Hmm.
I'm going to tell my wife tonight, you know, another woman called me knowledgeable today. So, yeah. But she'll be fine. She'll say that's great. But yeah, I thought I was going to be cool by picking McCartney 2 and not choosing an obvious one. And again, I mean, there's between the four of them, you know, over 70 different recordings that could choose, but I will go with an obvious one, or to me, an obvious one, and that would be Ringo, 1973. I think that there's so much happening here. I think you have, you know, when you look at where Ringo was, you know, and I believe the recording of that album started in 1972. But, you know, the Beatles, even before they knew they were breaking up, you know, he was doing Sentimental Journey, and then he did Buku's the Blues later in 1970. And, you know, those are two genre exercises, I think, perfectly enjoyable and good for what they are. But he was putting a lot more effort into doing films at that time. And, you know, he was, you know, keeping busy playing on other people's records. And then he had the singles in 71 and 72, Don't Come Easy and Back Up Boogaloo. but his focus for about 2 years there was not on really being a major solo, even though he had a hit, two major hits, but that wasn't his sole focus. George, John, and Paul immediately were creating, all their, what so many people view as their magnum opuses over those first few years. That wasn't so much Ringo, but then he made that conscientious decision saying, okay, like I've done these films and I've done this, but I'm ready to put something out there. And not that there wasn't a lot of effort put into the first 2 records, but I'm going to make a rock and roll album. And, certainly appropriate for the guy who sang with a little help from my friends. And the guy who, frankly, everybody loved. It was very obvious that everyone just wanted to be around Ringo. And it's not hard to see why, especially watching Get Back. I've talked to so many people about Get Back, and it's so interesting seeing how everyone has so many wildly different views. Like, this is how they were viewing John, or this is how they were viewing Paul, or this situation in general. But absolutely everyone is like, Ringo's just the best. Ringo's the coolest. And so it wasn't a problem for him to get Harry Nilsson on his side and Mark Bolan, and to get Richard Perry on board, certainly to get, 4/5 of the band, and then of course the other 3 Beatles. And it's an excuse to see, 3 of them in the studio at the same time with Billy Preston and Klaus Voormann, who are a big part of the Beatles story, and then traveling over to London to do stuff with Paul and Linda too. And, there's that quote from John. It's so hard, Ken, I've heard you say a few times that, when it comes to the Beatles story, it's hard because on one hand, you want to believe what comes out of their mouths, but on the other hand, it's so hard to believe what they say half the time, because you look at some of the stuff that John says, it's like, we're saying this one day and this the next day, and then this, and then other stuff that they've said where you then uncover more information. You're like, they had that totally wrong. And I agree with you.
Point out specifically what you mean, but John was someone who did change his opinions, but I did think that he meant what he said.
I completely agree. I think that he, for better or worse, was always in the moment, very honest in what he was thinking. And there's that quote from him, talking about, well, how come, Paul wasn't on I'm the Greatest? And I said, well, if he had been in LA that day. And it's like, well, did he mean that? I would love to be there and see, because then there's other reports. It's like, well, hey, they're talking about reforming the Beatles, but without Paul. We'll have Billy and Klaus in the band. And those are 2 very different things. One mindset saying, yeah, screw Paul, let's keep doing this. Or another saying, hey, if Paul was here, yeah, this could work. Because at that time, they were all, maybe not all, but like a lot of the sourness between all of them was cooling down a little bit. The other, John, George, and Ringo were kind of realizing, like, maybe Alan Klein isn't the best guy in the world. And there is kind of a renaissance happening, when 73 rolls around. You've got the Red and the Blue albums, and then, My Love becomes a hit, and eventually Red Rose Speedway is #1 album. Living in the Material World is a #1 album. Give Me Love, I think, was a #1 song. Yeah. And then, not so much John, because Sometime in New York City was the year before, and that was, not really a success. But, he had 2 years of goodwill built up between the 2 studio albums, and then the singles, Power to the People, Cold Turkey, Instagram, and everything. So to me, just their intrapersonal relationships. But then, to me, truly, there are 2 ways that I find when I listen to shows about Ringo or podcasts or any conversations about Ringo, there's 2 ways that people generally tend to value him that I don't agree with whatsoever. There are people who think that he, certainly good drummer, and the Beatles wouldn't have been the same without him. But, after the Beatles, yeah, okay, he put out that one pretty good record and a couple other songs. but there's no need to take it seriously because he's Ringo. He's Thomas the Tank Engine. He's peace and love and change the world. And I won't sign any more autographs and the MS Paint. And look, I get it. I'll make jokes about all those things too, but you're not taking him seriously. And on the flip side of it, there's people who aren't taking him seriously because they're treating him without even recognizing it as a novelty. Like, oh, well, this is good for Ringo, you know, like, or yeah, you know, this is cute, or, you know, it's good and it's fun. It's like, okay, yeah, but you don't need to treat him with kid gloves. You know, he is an artist and he deserves to be both praised and criticized, I think, as any other artist would. I don't think, you know, I'm not going to show my hand of what I think about any particular song or album, but I'm not going to look at a song like Tango All Night and be like, oh, well, it's fun, it's Ringo. I'm like, no, this is a really crappy song, in my opinion, in every single way. And I don't need to make excuses for it. Apologies if any of you are huge fans of Tango All Night. But
I like Ringo.
But sure, that's just one song in particular. But those same people, but there's other people who might be like, well, why would I ever need to listen, you know, to anything that Ringo did after that? It's like, well, have you heard King of Broken Hearts? Or have you heard you know, Walk With You? You know, there's so much good stuff that, you know, regardless of what you think about the oeuvre overall, it all comes back to not taking him seriously. And I think Ringo deserves to be taken seriously, even if that means having to criticize him when he deserves to be criticized. You know, Sam, you and I probably have the exact same feelings on the Change the World EP, but I'm still going to take it seriously. It's because I take it seriously that I have the thoughts that I have on it. And so for me, it would be really interesting to see essentially the beginning of him really taking his career by the reins and saying, we're going to do this. We're not just going to do a single, and we're not going to do a genre exercise. We're going to make a rock and roll record. And yeah, I've got a lot of other people writing songs for me, and I've got a lot of other people on this, but this is still my album. And I think it would be absolutely fascinating to see his thought process throughout all that. I certainly think it would be awesome to be able to hang out with the band and the other Beatles and Mark Bolan and all those musicians. So yeah, I just think it's fascinating.
Well, I'm sure you've heard me say this, but you know, when it comes to the solo Beatles, I can handle all the criticism in the world as long as you listened to the music and gave it a chance. Most of the people who are critical don't really know it. And especially when it comes to Ringo. We just did a show on Talk More Talk, one of my podcast shows, where we each listed 5 songs from 2000 to the present that we feel are overlooked. I mean, forget about from 1970 through 1999. We're just looking at the last 2 decades, and there's a lot of great stuff there. The great stuff didn't stop when the Beatles ended or after the Ringo album or Goodnight Vienna. There's a lot of worthwhile stuff on all of his albums. And the only way you'd know that is if you took the time to really listen. So I certainly don't mind being critical. And yeah, I do like Tango All Night, but you have every right not to like it, Dylan. But just the mere fact that with the Ringo album, there is something to be said, not just of the magic of the Beatles when they're together, but the other 3 knew how to write for Ringo. They knew how to write songs in his vocal range. I still think that while, you know, the 3 really big hits that Ringo co-wrote with George, although they're mainly, in the case of It Don't Come Easy, Ringo said George wrote 1 verse and a bridge. We think that George co-wrote Back Off Boogaloo, and Photograph they wrote together. But of the songs that were written entirely by the other 3 individually, I think 6 O'Clock is the best. It's such a masterpiece of a song. It's a perfect pop song all the way through. Ringo sounds great vocally. The middle 8 of the song is fantastic. The synthesizer solo in the middle is perfect. Everything was just right about that song. I just think it's one of you know, the best songs of his solo career right there. And then you can't go wrong with I'm the Greatest, and certainly Photograph and Sunshine Life for Me. There's only one chord in that song, right? Sunshine Life for Me. There's only one chord in that whole song, right?
Yeah,
I
it's just an
think
E
so.
chord the entire time.
Imagine what you
My
could do with one chord.
I love Sunshine Life for me.
Uh-huh.
My only, it's one of my favorite Ringo songs, period. My only issue with that song is that it's got Vinnie Poncia and George on the background vocals, and they sound great, but you had Levon Helm and Rick Danko in the studio right there,
Uh-huh.
two of the best singers of all time, and I'm like, why? Like, it's the band on the recording, like,
Right.
why not let them sing? But that's a minor what could have been.
Yeah. You had Your 16 on there. Great version of that song. Oh My was a major hit. You and Me, Babe, to me, I think is one of the greatest album closers of all time.
Great cover of Have You Seen My Baby, Randy Newman tune.
Randy Newman song. So yeah, obviously you can't go wrong with the Ringo album. So these were all just great choices. I never know what to expect when I have my guests on and they give me their choices. I certainly never know what to expect when Sam is on, and you do not disappoint. So
Take that
thank
as
you
a
guys
call.
for doing this. We're going to be providing links in my description box if you want to get in touch with my guests and know about their shows. And yeah, I did want to mention one thing. Oh, did you want to say something, Sam?
Oh, no, I was pointing down.
Okay. My radio show called Every Little Thing, which has been on the air for over 40 years. I just got one new station. I'm on over 50 stations worldwide. And this new station is Mersey Radio. They're an internet radio station, and they're based out of Liverpool. So I finally feel like I've been accepted. I think I've passed the audition after 40 years to be on a radio station that comes out of Liverpool.
Thanks,
So-
Well deserved, Ken. Congratulations.
Thank you. If you want to listen to Every Little Thing, there is a link that I will put in the description box of all the radio stations that carry it, the broadcast times, and links to their websites so you can stream them. It's not a show you can hear on demand. You have to listen to it as a live stream. But I'm heard on Mersey Radio Thursdays from 11 to 1 Eastern time. They run 2 shows back to back. So give some support not only to the show, but to a radio station out of Liverpool. All right. So Dylan, Skylar, and Sam, thank you so much for doing this. This has been fun getting your perspectives on Beatle and solo Beatle albums here that you would have liked to have attended the sessions for. And we'll do this again real soon, another Youngblood show, maybe with different questions. So thanks to all of you for watching, and we'll see you next time. Take care.
Ouch.